Hello everyone, my name is Chelsea Watson and this is my presentation on the evolution of criminal justice in the United States. This presentation will briefly discuss significant historical aspects of the criminal justice system, including the creation of actual police forces, the racial turmoil of the 50s and 60s, the creation of the RICO Act, the introduction of DNA evidence in the 80s, and the creation of the Patriot Act in 2001. It will also discuss the equity, fairness, and social justice perspectives of all of these issues. Finally, one of the most significant cases in criminal justice history will be discussed, along with the effects that this case still has on our modern-day justice system. Up first, we have the creation of actual police forces. Now, at the start of the United States, colonial America had a system that was for-profit. It was privately funded with part-time employees, and they also had volunteer night watches who were meant to keep a lookout for prostitution and gambling offenses. It was a very inefficient system because a lot of the people involved were sleeping or drinking while on duty or being put on duty as punishment. In 1838, as populations grew, Boston created the first publicly funded, legitimate police force with full-time officers. However, the southern states were not interested in a real police force, and they maintained the slave patrols that were created in 1704 until the Civil War created so-called sheriffs, who essentially functioned the same way until the change was unavoidable. As public order needs changed, so did policing, and by the late 1880s, all of the major cities in the United States had legitimate police forces. The racial turmoil of the 50s and 60s is not something that any of us will ever forget, and we're taught it as we go through our schooling. The civil rights movement during this time brought about a lot of changes to the institutional racism being faced mostly by African Americans. Plessy versus Ferguson created the separate but equal situation, but it was soon overturned by Brown versus the Board of Education, which said that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Other events such as the Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham bombings, and the March on Washington led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This made it illegal to discriminate based on race in public facilities and employment, and the Voting Rights Act the following year made it illegal to prevent disenfranchised African Americans from voting. Also, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 was amended in 1965 in order to remove immigration quotas based on national origin. Up next, we have the creation of the RICO Act. Now, organized crime had been a problem since the 1800s, and white-collar crime was a problem since the 1930s. It took a while, but in an effort to combat this, the federal government finally created the RICO Act in 1970, which stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The point of this act was to target these types of crimes by making it, quote, unlawful to acquire, operate, or receive income from an enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity. Also, it became a crime to even belong to an organization that was participating in racketeering. Since then, the RICO Act has been used to successfully prosecute thousands of criminals. One of the most important introductions to our criminal justice system was the introduction of DNA evidence. This first began in 1984 when a British university professor named Alec Jeffreys realized that he could use DNA to distinguish between family members. 2 years later, British police had him use DNA to verify a rape and murder confession, which did not match, and the suspect was acquitted and the real criminal was prosecuted. The following year, DNA was used for the first time in the United States to prosecute Tommy Lee Andrews, who had been accused of rape, convicted by the evidence, DNA evidence, and sentenced to 100 years in prison. Since then, DNA evidence is one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in most criminal court cases, and usually leads to convictions. When September 11th hit, none of us were expecting anything like that. It was nothing like anything we'd ever seen before. And so a month after that happened, President George W. Bush signed the USA Patriot Act into law. That stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. And what this act did was it gave federal agencies greater power over searches and seizures, with no warrant being required initially, roving wiretaps for surveillance, and greater access to information from ISP providers. It also gave them methods to prevent money laundering, increase border security, and speed up compensation to the victims of terrorism. Now, this act was immediately controversial, and the ACLU and the Electronic Freedom Foundation quickly opposed it, forcing some amendments to be made. Most of the act is still in place, however, and it was reauthorized by Bush and later by Obama. Now, the main idea here behind social justice is equity and fairness. What equity means is that everyone gets equal treatment, and fairness means that everyone gets fair treatment, both of these regardless of race, age, gender, or any of the other factors that could be used to discriminate against someone. This is a very important issue because it's meant to ensure that no one is above the law and that everyone gets punished equally for the same crimes. However, this is an ongoing battle, and it probably always will be. There is still a great deal of racial inequity in our justice system, as well as class inequity. It always seems that the rich get punished less harshly for the same crimes as the poor and middle class do. Now, one of the most major cases that the United States ever had was Miranda versus Arizona. In 1963, Ernesto Miranda was arrested for kidnapping and rape. 2 hours into interrogation, he signed a confession and agreed that he had been informed of his legal rights. His lawyer, however, argued that he had actually not been informed of his rights, but in the end it didn't do any good. Not at first, anyway. He was convicted and sentenced. His lawyer appealed and lost, but finally the case made it to the Supreme Court. In a 5-4 majority decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Miranda's rights had indeed been violated and his conviction was overturned. As a result of this case, all arrestees are now required to be informed of their legal rights, called Miranda rights. The effects of this case are still in place today, and this result prevents a majority of false confessions or cases getting thrown out because of forgetful missteps by police. So in conclusion, our criminal justice system has a very long and storied history. Colonial America had privately funded part-time employees and night watches. The first police force wasn't created until 1838 in Boston. The South kept their slave patrols until the Civil War created sheriffs. But by the late 1880s, all major cities had legitimate police forces. In the 50s and 60s, racial turmoil changed a lot and really put a drive for social justice into motion. And in 1970, the RICO Act was created to combat organized crime and white-collar crime. Later, the introduction of DNA evidence would change our justice system forever. And the USA Patriot Act, created in 2001, changed the way that we fight terrorism to this day. Miranda v. Arizona created the Miranda rights, which are still in effect today. And social justice is still a frontline fight, with everyone fighting for equal and fair treatment, regardless of race, age, gender, class, or any other factor. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this.